that things like depression, and melancholy, and anger, and overeating, and on and on and on, are communicated in groups. It's called social contagion. There's actually a phrase for it. But not only are unhealthy and bad practices and habits communicated in groups, healthy practices and values are also communicated in groups. So we need healthy communities of congruence that will help reinforce our priorities, that will hold us accountable, that will ask questions, that will learn to talk about these kinds of things that I think are not being talked about enough in our culture. All right. What number am I on?
4.
4? Thanks. I don't know if any of you ever watched Monty Python. Monty Python used to do these lists, and they would name a certain number, and then they kept changing the numbers. So number 4. The 4th idea that I want you to think about is the idea of thresholds. The idea of thresholds. Now, what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that a lot of things in life that have a low threshold are not very rewarding. A lot of things in life that have a low threshold are not very rewarding. Usually, if you snap on, you're tired in the evening, work has been hard, and you snap on the television, that's easy, right? It's really easy now, with remote control. The threshold is low. Most people, after watching 2 or 3 hours of television, don't say, "Ah, I feel good. I feel invigorated." Okay? Okay? Now, sometimes that's what you need to do. You need to be accountable. I'm not saying it's never appropriate, but I'm just saying low threshold is usually a low payoff. Okay? High threshold has a high payoff. It has a high reward. Okay? So I walk to work. It's 8 kilometers. That's a high threshold way of going to work. And I can tell you that as I set off every morning, I'm not like, "Whoa, I'm really excited I get to walk to work today." No, I'm too much of a, but you know, I'm not like that. But I can tell you that I have never regretted walking to work. I've never said, "Man, I wish I didn't walk today." It doesn't matter how bad the weather is, how bad the surface is, doesn't matter whether it's cold, doesn't matter whether I get wet. By the time I get to work, I'm like, I'm glad I did that. I may be damp, I may be cold, but you know, my muscles are kind of invigorated, and I breathe fresh air, and you know, I feel good. High threshold, high payoff. So, and we live in a culture that really values low thresholds. And what I want to encourage you to do is to start thinking about activities that have a higher threshold because the reward will be high. Now, I'm going to put a little reversal in here too, and that is to say, at the same time, raise the threshold against the things that are not a priority and lower the threshold for things that are priorities. What do I mean by that? When we moved to Indiana, we made a decision, and that is we decided to move where the TV was. TV used to be in the living room in a place of prominence, and this was a problem because I really like TV. Just so you know, I'm the one in the family who has a TV problem. Everybody else is restrained and balanced, but I was too tempted by it. So we put the television in the basement. So this meant that when I had a hard day at work and I was sitting in the living room, I felt too tired to read. If I wanted to watch the television, I would have to get up, I'd have to walk through the living room, I'd have to walk down the hall, I'd have to walk down the creaky stairs, and at some point my wife would say, "Are you really going to watch TV again?" Okay? So what this did was it raised the threshold against TV, and I watched TV a lot less. Okay? So some people put the TV in a closet, put it in whatever. Find ways of raising the threshold against things that are not your priority, and find ways of lowering the threshold for things that are your priority. So I told you that walking is important to me, so I make sure to have good shoes. I make sure to have good rain gear. I make sure to have, when I go on hikes, to have equipment that I enjoy. It helps lure me in, and it lowers the threshold. Okay? So the idea of thresholds is really important. And then the final thing that I would say is find ways in your life of introducing focal practices. Again, this is Borgman's idea. And what I want to say is there are practices in our lives that give us life. And some of these things are traditionally spiritual practices, but there are also other things like woodworking, creativity, pottery, gardening. These all can act as focal practices. And in writing the book, Living into Focus, I actually went and interviewed somebody who bikes to work. I interviewed a potter, a baker, a quilter, a carpenter, a bird watcher. She was an 80-year-old bird watcher who had been watching birds for 12 years, and it changed her life. There's no exaggeration. And so I interviewed these people about their focal practices, and they put focal practices first in their life, and it reoriented their priorities. Let me say a couple things about focal practices, and then I need to wrap up. If you want to change your life, if you want to find balance in your life, what you don't want to do is try to bring too much change at once. You want to start incrementally and build up. For years now, I've been teaching at seminary, and I've been teaching spiritual disciplines to students, and I ask students to draw a guideline for their spiritual disciplines, and it regularly happens that some students draw up such an ambitious agenda for themselves. 3 hours of prayer a day. And they're very euphoric and very excited, and it might work for a week, it might work for 2 weeks, and then it crashes, and then what happens is they don't pare back from 3 hours to 2 hours and 50 minutes and 2 hours. They just toss the whole thing. And what I've found is it's much better to start small and add on. So add one focal practice in your life and get that established and add some more onto that. And I think the church needs to think about 2 focal practices. How do we help people with 2 focal practices, 2 neglected focal practices? And one is, we have to start talking about Sabbath again. What does it mean to honor Sabbath? What does it mean to tap into those roots and those priorities? Now, you have a tradition. Your tradition is very strong on Sabbath, and it became, I think, it became legalistic, it became oppressive, and it's sort of been tossed. But I think there are creative ways of re-engaging it and reinvigorating that tradition. So we need to talk about Sabbath, to introduce the Sabbath rhythm into our lives. The other thing that we ought to talk about is we have to start talking about eating together again. Eating together is disappearing in our culture. People are not having meals together. People who eat at home don't even eat together. They'll eat when it's convenient. They'll eat in separate rooms, or they'll eat around the table but play with their screens while they're eating. And we have to start talking about eating together again. Eating is a Christian concern. We celebrate eating in communion. We celebrate eating in church potlucks. I have a friend who says, if you can read the gospel without getting hungry, you're not paying attention. Eating is important in the Bible. It's important to faith, it's important to relationships, it's important to families. And again, studies are showing that children who grow up in families that eat together are better off when they grow up. They're better adjusted socially, they do better in school, they do better in their work. It makes a huge difference whether or not we eat together. And one of the important countercultural practices that the church needs to emphasize is the priority of eating together. Okay? Now here's the thing. You're probably not going to persuade people to have 3 meals a day together for 7 days a week. But what about a program that encourages, just starts families off and says, prioritizing have 1 meal, if that's the achievement, have 1 supper together a week, where that's the priority for the household, and build from there. And if it's hard to have 1 supper together, find ways of lowering the threshold and making it easier. If you have to pick up a few things at the grocery store that are always already prepared, do that. Because remember that the thing is, the power is being able to sit around the table and eat together. Okay? And build from there.